The camera pans across rolling fields of golden wheat swaying gently in the evening breeze. The sun hangs low on the horizon, casting long shadows across a sprawling farmstead that stands in stark isolation amid the vast Kansas prairie. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the heart of America's breadbasket, where the horizon stretches endlessly, and a man's worth is measured by the sweat of his brow, stands Oak Ridge Farm. To passing travelers on County Road 27, it looks like countless other family operations that have tilled this soil for generations. A modest two-story farmhouse weathered by decades of prairie winds, sturdy red barns, grain silos reaching skyward, and fields of wheat and corn extending to the horizon. But those who know its owner, Mason Everett, understand that appearances can be deceiving. At 58, Mason isn't just another hard-working farmer trying to coax a living from the unforgiving plains. He is a ghost, a shadow, a man whose very name once commanded respect in circles that officially don't exist. Now, he's about to remind a group of desperate thieves why some quiet men are better left undisturbed. The morning frost painted delicate patterns across the windows of the farmhouse as Mason's boots echoed on the worn wooden floors. Dawn was breaking over the eastern fields, transforming the sky into a canvas of crimson and gold. His breath formed small clouds in the crisp October air as he surveyed his kingdom from the wraparound porch. 320 acres of prime Kansas farmland that he'd purchased 7 years ago after walking away from 22 years with the Army's Special Forces. His gnarled hands, strong despite the years, wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee. The farm represented everything he'd fought for during his military career: peace, solitude, and a piece of American heritage worth protecting. In the distance, his prized wheat fields shimmered in the early morning light, nearly ready for harvest. This season's yield would be exceptional, perhaps the best since he'd taken over the old Henderson place. Mason's morning routine was as precise as any military operation. Up at 0500, coffee brewing in the cast-iron percolator his father had given him before his first deployment, a quick check of the perimeter cameras hidden throughout his property. Most farmers didn't have military-grade surveillance systems protecting their crops and equipment, but old habits died hard. Besides, in his former line of work, vigilance had often been the difference between life and death. He descended the worn porch steps, moving with a fluid grace that belied his age. The first stop was always the same: the large, weathered barn that dominated the eastern edge of the homestead. Inside, the earthy scent of hay and machine oil greeted him as he flipped the light switch. Farm equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars lined the walls: tractors, combines, and specialized harvesting equipment that represented years of investment. But it was the storehouse behind the barn that truly held Mason's attention this morning. Slightly smaller than the main barn, but built from the same sturdy oak, the structure appeared ordinary from the outside. Local farmers might assume it held seed, fertilizer, or perhaps additional equipment. They would be partially right, but they wouldn't know about the reinforced walls, the specialized security systems, or the other modifications Mason had made over the years. The storehouse contained not only this season's early harvest, but specialized equipment and other valuables that had become increasingly attractive targets in recent months. 3 farms within a 50-mile radius had been hit by sophisticated thieves in the past 2 months alone. Equipment, chemicals, and harvested crops had disappeared overnight, dealing devastating financial blows to families already living on the margins. Sheriff Hank Dawson had stopped by just yesterday, warning Mason to be vigilant. "These aren't your typical smash-and-grab operations," the sheriff had said, his weathered face grave beneath his department-issue hat. "They're organized, professional, Hit fast, disable security systems, and know exactly what to take and where to sell it. Got to be an inside connection, feeding them information about who's got what and when they're vulnerable. Mason had nodded, offering the appropriate concerns expected of a simple farmer. But internally, something had stirred. A familiar alertness that had kept him alive through 3 tours in Afghanistan and classified operations in a dozen countries that had never appeared in any news report. "I'll keep an eye out, Hank," he'd promised, knowing the sheriff had no idea what that truly meant, coming from a man with Mason's background. Now, as he approached the storehouse, Mason found himself scanning the surrounding area with practiced precision. His eyes caught the detail most would miss, a small depression in the soft earth near the south entrance, not from any animal he recognized. Crouching down, he examined it closer. A boot print, partially obscured but visible to his trained eye. Someone had been scouting his property, maintaining their distance from the cameras they could see, while unaware of the ones they couldn't. Inside the storehouse, Mason moved between towering shelves stocked with supplies and equipment. His early harvest, specialty grains that commanded premium prices, was stored here as well, in climate-controlled bins that maintained optimal conditions. Along the west wall stood his grandfather's gun cabinet, containing several hunting rifles and shotguns. All legal, all registered, and all far less lethal than the other tools Mason had access to. Behind a false panel in the rear of the storehouse lay a small room that didn't appear on any building plans. Here, Mason kept equipment he'd hoped never to need again, specialized tools from his former life that had somehow never been returned to the military. The small arsenal wasn't excessive, but in the hands of someone with Mason's training, it was more than sufficient. The locals at Millie's diner in town knew Mason as the quiet farmer who kept to himself, spoke softly, and always left generous tips. Millie herself, a sharp-witted widow in her 60s with bright silver hair and keen eyes, had taken a particular interest in Mason from the day he'd first walked into her establishment. "There's something in those eyes," she told her daughter, Caroline, one morning as they watched Mason sitting alone at the counter, methodically working through his breakfast. "Same look my brother Thomas had after Vietnam. Man's seen things, done things, carries it with him like a shadow." Mason's farming operation wasn't the largest in Clagston County, but it was arguably the most efficient. He ran a precision operation, using cutting-edge technology and techniques that neighboring farms often viewed with a mixture of skepticism and admiration. His wheat and corn yields consistently outperformed county averages, and his specialized grain varieties commanded premium prices from organic food producers. His farmhands, just 2 of them, were local men he'd trained personally, instilling in them a level of discipline and attention to detail that bordered on military precision. David Cooper, his head hand, had been with him since the beginning. The 30-year-old had initially struggled with Mason's exacting standards, but had come to appreciate the methodology behind his boss's seeming obsession with procedure and awareness. "The way he teaches us," Cooper would tell his drinking buddies at the county's only bar, "it's like he's preparing us for something bigger than just farming." He wasn't wrong. Mason finished his inspection of the storehouse with the same thoroughness that characterized everything he did. Each door was checked, each window examined, each security sensor verified. Most people would consider it paranoia, but Mason considered it preparation. The professional thieves targeting local farms would eventually make their way to Oak Ridge. It was just a matter of time. As the morning sun climbed higher, Mason returned to the farmhouse, his mind already calculating adjustments to the security systems. The boot print outside the storehouse confirmed what his instincts had already told him. They were being watched, assessed. The thieves were smart enough to do reconnaissance, which meant they were smart enough to be dangerous. Inside the farmhouse, Mason settled at the heavy oak table that dominated the kitchen, spreading out detailed schematics of the storehouse and surrounding grounds. The plans weren't just architectural drawings, but tactical maps, identifying lines of sight, potential approach vectors, and defensive positions. Years of Special Forces training didn't disappear just because a man traded his combat boots for work boots. His satellite phone, kept for emergencies and secured against standard tracking, buzzed with an incoming message. The number was unlisted, but Mason recognized it immediately. Farm equipment theft ring operating in your region. Professional crew with military background. CCTV footage suggests former Rangers or similar. Watch your six. The message was from Colonel James Harrington, Mason's former commanding officer and one of the few people who knew where he'd settled after leaving the service. The colonel had resources far beyond a local sheriff's department and occasionally passed along information he thought Mason might find useful. Mason sent a brief acknowledgement, then returned to his schematics with renewed purpose. If the thieves were indeed former military, standard security measures wouldn't be sufficient. They would know how to bypass conventional alarms, how to move undetected, how to neutralize typical deterrents. But they didn't know who they were targeting. They couldn't know they were planning to steal from a man who had spent decades becoming one of the military's most effective combat engineers, an expert in creating defensive positions that turned terrain itself into a weapon. With practiced efficiency, Mason began modifying his plans, creating a comprehensive defensive strategy centered around the storehouse. He wasn't just protecting property, he was sending a message. The thieves had chosen the wrong farm, and they were about to learn why some quiet men living peaceful lives should be left alone. By mid-morning, Mason had completed his revised security plan. It was time to implement the first phase. Subtle modifications to the storehouse and surrounding area that would appear innocent to casual observation, but would create a formidable defensive network. He packed the schematics into a weathered leather satchel and headed toward the main barn where Cooper would be performing maintenance on the combine harvester. The young man looked up from his work as Mason entered, wiping grease from his hands with a stained rag. "Morning, Mr. Everett. Got the harvester almost ready for next week? Thinking we might beat the Johnson farm to market this year." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mason nodded, assessing the younger man. Cooper was reliable, hard-working, and intelligent. Qualities Mason valued, but what was about to happen at Oak Ridge Farm wasn't something Cooper needed to be involved in. "David, I need you and Mike to take some time off. Paid leave, starting tomorrow." Cooper's brow furrowed in confusion. "Sir, harvest is just a week away. We can't afford to—" "I need you clear of the farm for a few days," Mason interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded elite soldiers in the world's most dangerous places. "The sheriff stopped by yesterday. There's been talk about those equipment thieves working their way toward our section of the county." Understanding dawned in Cooper's eyes. "You think they're coming here? We should call the sheriff, get some deputies out." By the time the sheriff could respond, they'd be gone with half my equipment and this season's early harvest, Mason replied. "No, I've got some security upgrades to implement. Better if you and Mike aren't around for that." Cooper studied his employer, seeing something in the older man's stance and expression that gave him pause. "Mr. Everett, no disrespect, but this isn't something you should handle alone. These guys are professionals. Dangerous." A ghost of a smile touched Mason's lips. "I appreciate the concern, David, but trust me when I say I've dealt with dangerous professionals before." Something in Mason's tone made Cooper straighten slightly. For a brief moment, the farmhand glimpsed something beneath his employer's typical reserve, a hardness, a certainty that seemed out of place on a simple Kansas farmer. 3 days paid leave," Mason continued. "Consider it a bonus for the good work this season. Take that girl of yours somewhere nice." Cooper recognized the tone. It wasn't a suggestion. "Yes, sir. I'll let Mike know." As Cooper returned to his work, Mason surveyed the barn with new eyes, not as a farmer assessing his equipment, but as a tactician evaluating terrain. The thieves would come at night, most likely. They would focus on the storehouse first. It contained the most valuable portable items. They would expect conventional security. Cameras, alarms, perhaps a guard dog. They wouldn't expect what Mason Everett had in store for them. Walking back toward the farmhouse, Mason paused to look out over his fields, glowing golden in the late morning sun. He had chosen this place for its isolation and peace, and had built a new life here, far from the shadows of his military career. He took no pleasure in the thought of violence returning to his life, even briefly, but he had not survived 3 tours in Afghanistan and countless classified operations by being unprepared. If war had taught Mason Everett anything, it was that peace sometimes needed to be defended. And defense had always been his specialty. Inside the farmhouse, Mason placed a call to a number few people possessed. "Jackson," he said when the line connected. "It's Everett. I need some specialized equipment, preferably by tomorrow." The voice on the other end belonged to Sam Jackson, a former supply sergeant from Mason's unit who now operated a private security firm with access to equipment not readily available to civilians. "Everett," Jackson's deep voice carried a note of surprise. "Been a while. What kind of equipment are we talking about?" "The kind that discourages uninvited visitors without permanently damaging them." A pause. "These visitors, military background?" "Possibly," Mason confirmed. "Farm equipment theft ring. Professional." Another pause. "I can have what you need by tomorrow afternoon. Same arrangement as before?" "Same arrangement." After ending the call, Mason returned to the kitchen table and spread out his schematics once more. With practiced precision, he began marking specific points around the storehouse: entry points, approach vectors, lines of sight. Anyone watching would see a farmer reviewing building plans. They wouldn't recognize the careful calculation of a man who had once turned mountain passes in Afghanistan into impassable death traps for Taliban fighters. By the time darkness fell across Oak Ridge Farm, Mason had completed the initial preparations. The modifications were subtle: changes to the terrain around the storehouse, reinforcement of certain access points, the installation of hidden monitoring devices that went far beyond standard security cameras. Tomorrow, when the specialized equipment arrives, the real work will begin. Mason stood on his porch, watching the last light fade from the western sky, his weathered face set in grim determination. The peaceful farmer was receding, revealing glimpses of the warrior who had laid dormant these past 7 years. Whoever these thieves were, they had made a critical error in targeting Oak Ridge Farm. They would learn, perhaps painfully, that some quiet men living peaceful lives had earned that peace through means that made them exceptionally dangerous when threatened. As stars began to appear in the vast Kansas sky, Mason Everett took one last look at his kingdom before heading inside. The quiet farmer was preparing for war, and Oak Ridge Farm was about to become the last place any thief would ever want to visit. The first light of dawn found Mason already moving through his daily routine with military precision. The kitchen. Clock read 5:03 a.m. He'd never needed an alarm since his days in basic training. 22 years in special forces had permanently rewired his internal clock. His body still adhered to the rhythm of a soldier, despite 7 years of civilian life. Mason poured his first cup of coffee and moved to the eastern window, where he could watch the sun break over his wheat fields. The rippling gold reminded him of a different landscape, the undulating sand dunes outside Kandahar, where he'd spent 14 months during his second tour. The similarities ended there. These Kansas fields represented life and sustenance, not the ever-present danger of improvised explosives buried beneath shifting sands. His calloused fingers traced an old scar that ran from his left wrist to his elbow, a souvenir from an operation in Helmand Province that officially never happened. The wound had healed years ago, but on cold mornings like this, it served as a tactile reminder of the life he'd left behind. A series of monitors sat unobtrusively on a side table in the kitchen, cycling through feeds from cameras strategically placed around the property. Most were visible only to those who knew exactly where to look. Some weren't visible at all. The display currently showed the storehouse, still secure, with no sign of disturbance overnight. The boot print he'd discovered yesterday remained his only concrete evidence of surveillance, but Mason had learned long ago to trust the prickling sensation at the base of his skull that told him danger was approaching. Finishing his coffee, he moved to a locked cabinet in his study. The combination was his father's birthday, a simple memorial to the man who had taught him to farm this land before Mason had chosen a different path. Inside lay a worn leather journal filled with precise handwriting. This wasn't a diary in the traditional sense, but a record of skills and techniques accumulated through decades of professional experience. Mason flipped to a section marked Defensive Perimeters, Non-Lethal Deterrence, and began reviewing concepts he hadn't implemented. Since training exercises in Germany, his fingers traced diagrams of pressure plates, tripwires, and sensory disorientation systems. The principles remained sound, though he would need to adapt them for agricultural application. At 6:15, he closed the journal and headed to the barn. The morning chores wouldn't complete themselves, and maintaining normal patterns was essential. Anyone watching the farm needed to see exactly what they expected, just an aging farmer going about his daily business. The familiar rhythm of farm work allowed his mind to wander back to how he'd arrived at this juncture. Mason Everett hadn't been born to the Special Forces. The journey from Kansas farm boy to combat engineer had begun with the desire to see something beyond endless wheat fields and small-town life. He'd enlisted at 19, expecting to serve a single tour before returning to help his father work the family farm. But the military had discovered something in young Mason that even he hadn't recognized. An unusual spatial intelligence combined with meticulous attention to detail. His ability to assess terrain, identify vulnerabilities, and create defensive solutions had caught the attention of his superiors. By 23, he'd been recruited into Special Forces training, where his natural talents were honed into exceptional skills. Mason became known for his ability to transform ordinary environments into extraordinary defensive positions. He could turn a barren hillside into an impenetrable fortress, or make a simple village house into a secure command post using only the materials at hand. His specialty became defensive architecture, creating systems that could detect, delay, and deter enemy forces without revealing their presence until too late. While others in his unit specialized in direct action, Mason's gift was making sure they had a secure base to return to, or creating the perfect conditions for an ambush. The skills had served him well through multiple deployments across Afghanistan, Iraq, and classified operations in countries the American public didn't know their soldiers visited. Mason had seen combat, but his greatest contributions often happened before the fighting began, preparing spaces that gave his teammates every possible advantage. The irony wasn't lost on him that he now planned to use those same skills to protect wheat and farm equipment. But principles remained principles, regardless of application. The storehouse contained not just his early harvest, but specialized equipment worth nearly $500,000. More importantly, it contained his livelihood and the future of the land his family had farmed for 3 generations before him. By 7:30, Mason had completed the essential morning farm work. Cooper and the other hand, Mike Tanner, wouldn't arrive for another hour. That gave him time to begin the initial preparations without explanation. He grabbed a coil of wire and several small devices from a locked storage cabinet and headed toward the storehouse. The structure itself was deceptively ordinary. Board and batten siding weathered to a silver gray, a pitched metal roof with rain gutters that needed cleaning, and 3 main access points. Double doors on the east side, large enough to accommodate equipment, a standard entry door on the north face, and loading bay doors on the west side where trucks could back directly. Up to the building, the south face had only a small window, which Mason had already secured with steel shutters disguised as decorative elements. Anyone attempting to force entry through that window would find themselves dealing with reinforced steel behind seemingly ordinary glass. Mason began his work at the east doors, carefully drilling small holes at precise points in the frame. To an untrained eye, it would appear he was preparing to replace weather stripping or repair rot damage. In reality, he was creating mounting points for pressure sensors that would activate when the doors were forced open. The sensors themselves were unobtrusive, flat, wireless devices no larger than a quarter that could be concealed within the doorframe. They would transmit to a receiver in Mason's house, alerting him to any breach attempt, but they served a dual purpose. When connected to other systems he planned to install later, they would become the triggering mechanism for his first line of defense. As he worked, Mason mentally catalogued everything he knew about the theft ring targeting local farms. Sheriff Dawson had mentioned they disabled security systems, which meant they had either technical expertise or specialized equipment. They knew exactly what to take, suggesting inside knowledge of farm operations. And they moved quickly, indicating military-style planning and execution. If his suspicions were correct, and these were indeed former military personnel, he needed to prepare for adversaries who understood tactical movement, could recognize and bypass obvious security measures, and would be watching for conventional responses like armed confrontation. That realization shaped his strategy. Mason had no interest in a firefight on his property. Such confrontations were messy, unpredictable, and carried legal complications he preferred to avoid. Instead, he would employ the principles that had made him valuable to special forces, creating an environment that controlled the movement and options of his adversaries, that disoriented and delayed them, and ultimately left them vulnerable to capture by legitimate authorities. By the time Cooper's truck appeared on the long driveway, at 8:35, Mason had completed the initial sensor installation on all 3 main entrances. Nothing visible had changed about the storehouse, yet it was now impossible to enter without triggering an alert. Phase 1 complete. Cooper climbed out of his truck, followed by Mike Tanner, a stocky 25-year-old with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and hands that seemed purpose-built for mechanical work. Both men nodded respectfully as they approached. "Morning, Mr. Everett," Cooper said. "Weather Service says we've got clear skies through the weekend. Perfect timing for final preparations." Mason leaned his drill against the storehouse wall. "Change of plans. I need you both to take some time off. Paid leave, starting tomorrow morning." The 2 men exchanged puzzled glances before Tanner spoke up. "Sir, harvest is just around the corner. This doesn't seem like the time for vacation." "It's not optional," Mason replied, his tone softening slightly as he added, "There's been talk about those equipment thieves working their way toward our section of the county. I've got some security measures to implement, and it's better if you 2 aren't around for it." Cooper's eyes narrowed slightly. "With respect, Mr. Everett, if there's trouble coming, you might need the extra hands." Mason shook his head. "What's coming isn't something you need to be involved in. 3 days paid leave. Consider it appreciation for your hard work this season." He could see the protest forming on Tanner's face and added, "When you come back, the situation will be resolved, one way or another." Until then, I need to know you're clear of any potential trouble." The tone brooked no argument. Both men recognized when their boss had made an irrevocable decision. "Yes, sir," Cooper finally answered for both of them. "But we'll keep our phones on. Any trouble you call." Mason nodded, knowing he had no intention of making such a call. Whatever happened at Oak Ridge Farm in the coming days would be handled by him alone. The remainder of the morning passed with normal farm operations. Mason kept Cooper and Tanner busy with routine maintenance tasks, while he periodically checked his surveillance feeds for any sign of unwelcome observers. The property remained quiet, but the sensation of being watched never fully dissipated. At noon, the distinctive rumble of Sam Jackson's black pickup truck came rolling up the drive. The vehicle was muddy enough to look at home on any farm, but carried specialized modifications only a trained eye would notice. Reinforced chassis, run-flat tires and glass that was significantly thicker than standard. Jackson himself emerged from the driver's seat with the fluid movement of a man half his 56 years. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark skin and close-cropped salt-and-pepper hair, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a career soldier. His security firm primarily served corporate clients and wealthy individuals, but he maintained certain connections from his military days that occasionally proved useful to former colleagues. Mason met him halfway between the house and the drive, away from Cooper and Tanner, who were working on the irrigation pump. "Everett," Jackson extended a hand. "Still playing farmer, I see." "Not playing," Mason corrected, accepting the handshake. "I'm a farmer." Jackson's eyes, observant as ever, scanned the property. "A farmer with a perimeter security system most military bases would envy." He lowered his voice. "Got what you asked for. Some are prototypes, not commercially available. Had to call in a few favors." "Appreciate it, Sam. Let's get it unloaded." They moved to the truck bed where Jackson had concealed several hard-shell cases beneath canvas tarps that looked like they might be covering ordinary farm supplies. As they transferred the cases to Mason's workshop behind the main house, Jackson provided a quick briefing on each item. "Pressure-activated disorientation devices," he said, tapping one case. "Military-grade, but non-lethal. Combination of high-intensity strobes and targeted sound emission. Won't cause permanent damage, but will incapacitate anyone in a 15-foot radius for approximately 30 seconds. He moved to another case. "Adhesive deployment system, triggered by motion or remote activation. Creates an instant immobilization zone. Anyone stepping into it isn't going anywhere until the solvent is applied." Each case contained specialized equipment designed to incapacitate, disorient, or temporarily immobilize without causing lasting harm. Mason listened carefully, mentally cataloging how each piece would fit into his developing defensive strategy. "These people you're expecting," Jackson said as they finished unloading. "They dangerous, professional," Mason replied. "Organized, efficient, possibly former military." Jackson nodded thoughtfully. "You could call in some help. I've got men who'd be here within 4 hours." "Appreciate the offer, but no. This needs to be handled quietly." "Always the lone operator," Jackson shook his head. "Some things don't change." After Jackson departed, Mason instructed Cooper and Tanner to focus on preparations in the far fields for the remainder of the day. Once they were safely distant, he returned to the workshop and began unpacking the specialized equipment. Each item required careful consideration for placement and activation parameters. Mason worked methodically, creating a detailed deployment plan that transformed the seemingly ordinary storehouse into a sophisticated defensive position. Every entrance, every potential approach vector, every vulnerability was addressed with layered countermeasures. By late afternoon, he had completed the detailed planning phase and began the actual installation process. Motion sensors were carefully positioned to cover blind spots in the existing camera system. Pressure plates were installed beneath innocuous-looking floor mats and behind threshold strips. Tripwires, nearly invisible even in daylight, were strategically placed to trigger various deterrent systems. Each system was non-lethal but highly effective. Mason had no desire to seriously harm anyone, regardless of their intentions. His goal was to incapacitate, identify, and deliver to proper authorities. The thieves would find themselves captured, not injured, though their pride might suffer significantly. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the farm, Mason completed the final connections on the east entrance's defense system. The installation was invisible to casual inspection. Nothing about the storehouse appeared different from the previous day, yet it had been transformed into a sophisticated defensive position capable of incapacitating multiple intruders simultaneously. At the workshop, Mason created a simple control interface that would allow him to monitor all systems from his house. The small tablet displayed a schematic of the storehouse with indicators for each defense mechanism. Some would trigger automatically when their conditions were met. Others could be activated remotely as needed. Cooper and Tanner returned from the fields as darkness fell. Mason had prepared simple dinner, a pot of beef stew that had simmered all afternoon, and the three men ate in companionable silence at the kitchen table. Neither hand asked about the security measures, though Cooper's eyes occasionally drifted to the surveillance monitors visible from his seat. After dinner, as the two younger men prepared to leave, Mason handed each an envelope containing their pay, plus a generous bonus. 3 days, he reminded them. Keep your phones on, but don't come to the property unless I specifically call for you. Cooper hesitated at the door. Mr. Everett, I've worked for you for 7 years now. Never seen you this focused. These thieves, they're just after equipment. Nothing here worth risking your safety over. Mason met the younger man's concerned gaze. It's not about the equipment, David. It's about drawing a line. Some things need to be protected, even if others don't understand their value. Something in Mason's expression must have conveyed the futility of further argument. Cooper nodded once and followed Tanner to the waiting truck. Mason watched until their taillights disappeared down the long drive before returning to his preparations. Night hours would be dedicated to finalizing the defensive measures and conducting comprehensive testing. By morning, the storehouse would be fully prepared for unwelcome visitors. The irony wasn't lost on Mason that after years of creating defenses to protect American soldiers in foreign lands, he was now applying those same skills to protect a Kansas storehouse. But principles remain principles, and Mason Everett had always believed in defending what was his. The thieves targeting local farms had chosen poorly when they set their sights on Oak Ridge. They were about to learn why some quiet farmers were better left in peace. As midnight approached, Mason stood in the center of the storehouse, surveying his work with critical eyes. Every entrance was now rigged with multiple defensive measures that would activate in a carefully planned sequence. The systems were redundant, with backups for critical components, and designed to function even if primary power was cut. The quiet farmer had created a masterpiece of defensive architecture, invisible to the untrained eye, but devastatingly effective. Now all that remained was to wait for the inevitable visit from those who thought Oak Ridge Farm would be an easy target. They would discover, perhaps painfully, how wrong they were. The next morning, it dawned clear and crisp. Mason rose at his customary 5 a.m., his body responding to an internal clock that decades of discipline had perfected. For the first time in 7 years, however, the farm would be operating without Cooper and Tanner. The absence of their pickup trucks in the gravel drive created an unusual stillness. Mason welcomed the solitude. It reminded him of the early days at Oak Ridge, when he'd worked the land alone while learning to transition from soldier to civilian. Those first months had been challenging, not the physical demands, which his military-hardened body handled easily, but the psychological adjustment from a world of constant threat assessment to the steady rhythms of agriculture. He'd purchased the property after his father's passing. The original Everett farm, where Mason had grown up, had been sold years earlier when his parents retired to Arizona. But farming was in his blood, a connection to the land that even 22 years of military service couldn't sever. After his morning coffee, Mason walked the perimeter of his property, ostensibly checking irrigation lines, but actually verifying that his surveillance system remained intact. The boot print he'd discovered earlier had been joined by fresh tire marks along the access road, subtle evidence that someone had driven slowly past the farm sometime during the night. The reconnaissance was becoming more frequent. They would make their move soon. At 8:30, Mason drove his pickup into Clagston. The small town served as the commercial hub for surrounding farms, though hub was perhaps too generous a term for a single main street with essential businesses. Hardware store, farm supply, grocery, bank, post office, and Millie's diner. Most residents did their major shopping in Wichita, 60 miles east, but Clagston provided necessities and, more importantly, community. His first stop was the hardware store, where he collected supplies that would appear entirely ordinary for farm. Maintenance, wire, electrical tape, PVC pipe segments, and various fasteners. Nothing that would raise eyebrows, yet everything needed to complete his defensive preparations. Frank Wilson, who'd owned the hardware store for nearly 40 years, chatted amicably as he rang up the purchases. At 72, Frank knew every farmer in the county and considered it his personal responsibility to stay informed about their operations. "Heard you sent Cooper and Tanner off for a few days," he remarked, bagging Mason's items. Unusual timing with harvest coming. News traveled fast in small communities. Mason had expected this. "Giving them a break before the busy season," he replied easily. "They've earned it." Frank nodded, though his eyes held a question he didn't voice. "Sheriff was in earlier. Said to keep an eye out for any strangers asking about farm equipment or crop storage. Those thieves hit Peterson's place 2 nights ago, cleaned out their equipment shed, and took a year's worth of harvest records from the office." Mason frowned. "Peterson's is only 15 miles north of my place." "Exactly what the sheriff said. Tell me to mention it if I saw you." Frank leaned forward slightly. "Between us, Hank's worried they're working their way south. Says they're too organized for simple opportunists." "I appreciate the warning," Mason said, gathering his purchases. "I'll keep an eye out." His next stop was Millie's diner, where the mid-morning lull meant only a few tables were occupied. Millie herself stood behind the counter, filling coffee, cups and calling orders to her cook with practiced efficiency. At 64, she moved with the energy of someone decades younger, her silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Mason Everett," she called as he entered, already reaching for a coffee pot. "Your usual table's open." His usual was a booth near the back corner with clear sight lines to both the entrance and the kitchen door. Old habits. Millie brought coffee without being asked, then stood beside the table with the relaxed familiarity of someone who'd known him since his return to Kansas. "No Cooper today?" she asked. "Usually comes in with you on supply days." "Give him and Mike some time off before harvest." She studied him with shrewd eyes that missed little. Millie had been a military wife herself before losing her husband to cancer 15 years ago. She recognized the subtle signs of alertness in Mason's posture. "Heard about the Peterson place," she said quietly. "Sheriff's been in twice already this morning. Says he's going to increase patrols on the county roads." "But," she shrugged expressively, "county's too big, department's too small." "Not much he can do," Mason agreed. "Those Peterson boys are devastated. Equipment's insured, but the harvest records had all their proprietary data. Soil amendments, yield calculations, everything they've developed over 5 years of organic farming. Thieves knew exactly what they were taking. Mason absorbed this new information. The theft of agricultural data suggested something beyond simple equipment seizure. Proprietary farming methods could be worth more than tractors to the right buyers. "Caroline will bring your breakfast," Millie said, referring to her daughter who waited tables during the busy hours. "She's been asking about you." Mason suppressed a small smile. Millie's attempts at matchmaking were transparent but well-intentioned. Caroline Brooks, widowed young when her army husband died in a training accident, had returned to Clagston with her son 4 years ago. She was smart, capable, and, Mason had to admit, attractive in a genuine way that had nothing to do with artifice. She appeared moments later, carrying a plate loaded with his standard order: 3 eggs over medium, bacon, hash browns, and wheat toast. At 38, Caroline had her mother's energy and perceptiveness, with warm brown eyes that noticed details. "Morning, Mason," she said, setting down his breakfast. "Mom says you're working the farm alone for a few days." "Cooper and Tanner are taking some time off." She nodded, refilling his coffee. "Tommy's been asking when he can come out to see the combine again. Boy's fascinated with farm equipment." Tommy Brooks was 12, with his father's mechanical aptitude and his mother's intelligence. Mason had shown him the farm operations several times, impressed by the boy's genuine interest and quick understanding. "Harvest starts next week," Mason said. "He's welcome any time after that. Things are a bit unsettled at the moment." Something in his tone made Caroline look at him more closely. "You've heard about the thefts. Sheriff's got everyone on alert." She lowered her voice. "Mom says they're not ordinary thieves, says they're too organized, too specific in what they take. Dad always said criminals who do their homework are the most dangerous kind." Mason nodded. Caroline's father had been a detective in Kansas City before retiring to Clagston. His assessment aligned with Mason's own. "Your dad was a smart man." "Be careful out there, Mason," she said, her hand briefly touching his shoulder before she moved. To attend to other customers, the simple human contact, something that had been rare in his life since returning to civilian life, lingered warmly as he ate his breakfast. Despite his deliberate solitude, Mason had developed connections in Clagston, people who, in their own ways, had become important to him. After breakfast, Mason made his final stop at the farm supply store, where he purchased items needed for routine maintenance: filters for the tractors, replacement parts for irrigation, equipment, and 50-pound bags of specialized fertilizer. Nothing unusual for a farmer preparing for harvest, though the fertilizer would serve a different purpose than intended. By noon, he was driving back to Oak Ridge, the truck bed loaded with supplies. As he turned onto the access road leading to his property, he noticed a dark sedan parked on the county road about a quarter-mile past his entrance. The vehicle wasn't local, its sleek lines and tinted windows more suitable for urban environments than rural Kansas. Mason drove past his own entrance without slowing, continuing down the county road as if heading to another destination. As he approached the sedan, he noted the Michigan plates and absence of dust that should have accumulated on any vehicle that had been in the area for more than a few hours. This car arrived recently. The driver, a man in his 30s wearing sunglasses despite the overcast sky, appeared to be studying a map. He didn't look up as Mason passed, a studied non-interest that immediately registered as suspicious. Instead of confronting the stranger directly, Mason continued a half-mile further before turning around at the Henderson Properties abandoned access road. When he drove back, the sedan was gone. Surveillance confirmed, timetable accelerated. Mason turned into his own drive, mind calculating adjustments to his preparations. The presence of an obvious scout meant the actual operation would likely occur within the next 48 hours, possibly that very night. The thieves were growing bolder, their reconnaissance less subtle as they prepared for action. Once back at the farm, he unloaded his supplies and immediately began the final phase of his defensive preparations. The fertilizer bags were emptied into pre-positioned containers around the storehouse perimeter, not for agricultural use, but to create controlled terrain obstacles that would funnel any intruders toward his prepared defensive zones. By mid-afternoon, Mason had completed the external preparations and moved inside the storehouse to finalize the interior defensive measures. The building's contents were strategically reorganized to create choke points and concealed trigger mechanisms. Each doorway now contained multiple layers of defenses, invisible to casual observation, but devastatingly effective when activated. The specialized equipment Jackson had provided was carefully integrated into these systems. Motion-activated disorientation. Devices were positioned at key points, their sensors calibrated to distinguish between human movement and smaller animals. Adhesive deployment systems were installed at critical choke points, ready to create instant immobilization zones. Mason worked methodically, checking and double-checking each component. The integrated system would activate in carefully planned sequences, each triggered by specific intruder actions. The design was elegant in its simplicity, yet sophisticated in its effects, much like the defensive positions he'd created in mountain passes and urban environments during his military career. By late afternoon, he had completed the technical installations and moved to the psychological elements of his defense. These were subtle adjustments to the environment designed to influence intruder behavior. Strategic placement of valuable equipment to draw attention in specific directions, lighting positioned to create false shadows, and carefully arranged sightlines that concealed the actual defensive measures. As the sun began to set, Mason conducted a final walkthrough of the storehouse, mentally triggering each system to ensure proper sequencing. The integrated defense would activate progressively, each layer designed to incapacitate, disorient, or immobilize without causing permanent injury. Satisfied with his preparations, Mason secured the storehouse and returned to the farmhouse. The evening routine proceeded normally. Dinner prepared and eaten, equipment maintenance logs updated, weather reports checked for the coming days. To any observer, it would appear to be an ordinary evening on a Kansas farm. Only the additional weapons check was unusual. Mason's legally owned shotgun and hunting rifle were cleaned and loaded, placed strategically near entry points in the house. He had no intention of using them if his defensive systems worked as designed, but contingency planning had been drilled into him through decades of military service. As darkness settled over the farm, Mason's satellite phone vibrated with an incoming message from an unlisted number. Intelligence suggests an operation planned for tonight. Team of 68. Electronic countermeasures. Military precision. Local contact providing layout information. Colonel Harrington's sources were rarely wrong. Mason sent a brief acknowledgement and began his final preparations. The message's mention of local contact confirmed his suspicion that the theft ring had inside information about target farms. Someone in the agricultural community was betraying their neighbors. At 9 p.m., Mason initiated the surveillance protocol he'd established, regular checks of camera feeds, motion sensors, and perimeter alarms. The property remained quiet, though experience told him that professional operators would wait until well after midnight before making their move. He used the waiting time to review mental scenarios for various intrusion patterns. The thieves would likely approach from the south, using the tree line for cover. They would target the storehouse first, focused on the specialized equipment and early harvest grain. Based on their previous operations, they would attempt to disable security systems before approaching, likely using electronic countermeasures to disrupt wireless communications. Mason had anticipated this. His defensive systems included redundant hardwired components that would function even if wireless communications were jammed. The apparent vulnerability was actually part of his design, encouraging the intruders to believe they had successfully neutralized security measures would make them less cautious in their approach. At 10:30 p.m., Mason changed into dark clothing, more suitable for nighttime movement. The outfit wasn't tactical gear, just dark jeans, a black thermal shirt, and a charcoal canvas jacket. But it would allow him to move around his property without being easily spotted. Midnight came and went with no sign of intruders. Mason maintained his vigilance, knowing that patience was often the deciding factor in these situations. Professional operators preferred the deepest hours of night, when human alertness naturally waned. At 1:17 a.m., the first perimeter sensor activated, a silent alert on Mason's monitoring tablet showing movement in the tree line south of the storehouse. The thermal camera in that sector showed heat signatures consistent with human bodies. At least 6 individuals moving in a practiced formation that confirmed his suspicions about their military background. Mason watched their approach without immediately responding. Their movement patterns were disciplined and coordinated, utilizing available cover and maintaining appropriate spacing. They carried equipment cases and what appeared to be electronic devices, likely signal jammers and security bypass tools. Their target was definitely the storehouse. The lead elements moved toward it with purpose, stopping periodically to use scanning equipment that was probably checking for security measures. Mason allowed himself a small smile when they appeared to relax slightly after using their electronic countermeasures. They believed they had disabled his security systems. The trap was set. The intruders were proceeding exactly as he had anticipated. Now he would watch as 7 years of peaceful farming gave way to the skills he had hoped never to use again. The thieves had chosen the wrong farm, and they were about to learn why some quiet men were better left undisturbed. Mason settled into his observation position, monitoring tablet in hand, as the intruders approached the first of his defensive measures. The quiet Kansas night was about to become considerably less peaceful, and Oak Ridge Farm was about to become the last place any thief would ever want to target. Mason watched the thermal signatures as they approached his property boundary. 6 figures moved with disciplined precision through the tree line, maintaining proper spacing and using available cover. Their movement patterns confirmed his suspicions about their training. These weren't opportunistic criminals, but professionals with tactical experience. The lead figure held what appeared to be an electronic device, periodically stopping to scan the area ahead. Signal jammers, most likely, designed to disrupt wireless security systems, standard procedure for sophisticated theft operations. Mason allowed himself a small smile. Let them believe their countermeasures were working. The monitoring tablet showed the intruders pausing at the edge of the tree line, approximately 200 yards from the storehouse. They were studying the approach, looking for security cameras, motion sensors, or other obvious defenses. Finding none visible, Mason had concealed his systems too well for casual detection. They began their advance across the open ground. Their formation was textbook. Staggered approach with overlapping fields of vision, lead elements moving while others provided overwatch. Definitely military training or law enforcement background. They moved with the confidence of professionals who had done this many times before. Mason switched the tablet display to show the storehouse interior. Everything remained as he had arranged it. Valuable equipment positioned to draw immediate attention, creating natural movement patterns that would lead intruders directly into his prepared defensive zones. At 1:24 a.m., the first perimeter defense activated silently. A buried pressure sensor registered the weight of an intruder crossing the invisible boundary Mason had established 50 yards from the storehouse. The tablet display showed the exact location, southwest corner, approaching the loading bay doors. Mason had anticipated this approach vector. The loading bay appeared to offer the easiest access, with large doors designed for equipment transfer. What the intruders couldn't know was that those doors now concealed the most sophisticated elements of his defensive system. The lead figure stopped 30 yards from the storehouse, using a handheld device to scan for electronic security measures. After a moment, he signaled to the others with a practiced hand gesture. The electronic countermeasures had apparently confirmed what they wanted to believe. The security systems were disabled or non-existent. Mason watched as they converged on the loading bay doors. One intruder carried what appeared to be specialized entry tools, bolt cutters, pry bars, and what was likely an electronic lock bypass device. Professional equipment for professional thieves. For a brief moment, Mason considered simply calling the sheriff. Hank Dawson was a good man, but the county sheriff's department was understaffed and spread thin across hundreds of square miles. By the time deputies could respond, the thieves would be gone, with their haul of equipment and agricultural data. No, this needed to be handled directly. The thieves had to be caught in the act, with evidence that would ensure prosecution. More importantly, they needed to learn that some targets weren't worth the risk, a lesson that would protect not just Oak Ridge Farm, but every agricultural operation in the county. The lead intruder reached the loading bay doors and began examining the locks while the others maintained a perimeter. Their discipline was impressive. Regular scanning of surroundings, maintenance of proper distances, minimal unnecessary movement. These were men who understood tactical operations. Unfortunately for them, they were facing someone who had spent decades mastering the art of countering such operations. Mason watched as the lock specialist began working on the loading bay's heavy padlock. The lock itself was ordinary, a commercial-grade padlock that would offer minimal resistance to their specialized tools. But it served a purpose beyond security. Embedded within the lock housing was a pressure sensor that would activate the moment the lock was compromised. At 1:32 a.m., the padlock yielded to the intruder's tools with a metallic snap that carried in the still night air. The tablet display immediately registered the breach, though no audible alarm sounded. Mason's system was designed to alert only him, allowing the intruders to believe they had succeeded in entering undetected. The loading bay doors slid open with a low rumble. The intruders paused, listening for any response to the noise, then proceeded when none came. 4 entered the storehouse while 2 remained outside as lookouts, positioned to observe the approaches from the farmhouse and the main road. Mason switched the tablet display to the interior cameras. The 4 intruders had activated tactical flashlights, narrow beam lights that provided illumination while minimizing visible signatures from outside. They moved with purpose, immediately identifying the high-value targets Mason had deliberately positioned to draw their attention. The leader directed his team with hand signals, pointing to specific equipment they had clearly identified in advance. One man began photographing documents Mason had left visible, maintenance logs and harvest projections that contained valuable proprietary data about his specialized grain varieties. The theft of agricultural data confirmed what Mason had suspected. These operations weren't just about equipment. They were industrial espionage targeting farming innovations. The equipment was simply a bonus, valuable for resale, but secondary to the intellectual property represented in farming methods and crop development. As the thieves began their methodical collection process, they unwittingly triggered the first phase of Mason's defensive system. Invisible laser triggers, crossed by their movements, activated a sequencing timer. They now had exactly 45 seconds before the first countermeasure deployed. Mason rose from his monitoring position in the key farmhouse and moved silently toward the door. He would need to be closer when the system activated, ready to observe and adjust if necessary. Years of operational experience had taught him that no plan survived first contact without some modification. The night air felt cool against his face. As he moved across the darkened yard, keeping to the shadows and using outbuildings for cover, His movements were those of a man who had spent years learning to traverse hostile territory undetected, fluid, deliberate, and precisely calculated to minimize visual signature. From his new position behind the equipment shed, Mason had a clear view of the storehouse and the two lookouts. The men were professional but not exceptional, maintaining reasonable vigilance but betraying small signs of complacency. They believed their electronic countermeasures had neutralized any security systems and that the isolated rural location minimized risk of discovery. Both assumptions were about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Inside the storehouse, the thieves had begun collecting their targeted items. One was disconnecting a specialized seed sorting machine, equipment worth nearly $80,000 and small enough to transport easily. Another was copying data from Mason's farm management system onto a portable drive. The remaining two were gathering containers of specialty grain samples, the early harvest Mason had stored for seed development. At precisely 1:37 a.m., their 45 seconds expired. The first defensive measure was activated without warning. Hidden speakers embedded in the storehouse walls emitted a directional sound pulse at a specific frequency designed to cause immediate disorientation without permanent damage. Simultaneously, strategically placed LED arrays activated with a precisely calculated strobe pattern known to trigger temporary sensory confusion. The effect on the intruders was immediate and dramatic. All four inside the storehouse staggered, dropping equipment as they instinctively raised hands to their ears and eyes. The combination of sound and light, imperceptible outside the building, created a disorienting environment that disrupted their ability to function as a coordinated team. Mason had designed this initial countermeasure specifically to be non-damaging, but temporarily debilitating. The effects would last approximately 20 seconds, just long enough to trigger panicked movement that would lead them into secondary defensive measures. The thieves reacted predictably, stumbling toward what they perceived as the nearest exit, the loading bay doors through which they had entered. This movement triggered the second phase of Mason's system. As they crossed an invisible boundary 10 feet from the exit, pressure plates beneath ordinary-looking floor mats activated the adhesive deployment system. Compressed air canisters released a specialized polymer across a 6-foot section of concrete floor. The clear substance appeared momentarily as a fine mist before settling onto the surface. As the first disoriented intruder stepped into the affected area, his boot adhered instantly to the floor with a force that prevented further forward movement. The man lurched forward, expecting normal momentum, but finding himself suddenly anchored in place. His upper body continued its forward motion while his foot remained firmly planted, causing him to lose balance and fall forward. His hands, reaching out to break his fall, contacted the treated surface and became similarly immobilized. The second thief, close behind, saw his companion fall, but couldn't process what had happened through his own disorientation. He stepped into the same treated area and immediately found himself struggling against the powerful adhesive. Within seconds, both men were effectively immobilized, not injured but completely incapable of movement. The remaining two intruders, witnessing what had happened to their companions, attempted to retreat deeper into the storehouse, seeking an alternative exit. This reaction had been anticipated in Mason's defensive design. Their movement toward the side door triggered the third phase of his system. As they approached this secondary exit, motion sensors activated another countermeasure. A fine mesh net, nearly invisible in the dim light, deployed from concealed housings in the ceiling. Weighted corners ensured the net descended in a pattern that entangled both men before they could react. The more they struggled, the more securely the specialized mesh tightened around them. Outside, the two lookouts remained unaware of the chaos unfolding inside the storehouse. The building's insulation and the directional nature of the sound pulse had contained the auditory elements of Mason's countermeasures. From their vantage points, everything appeared normal. Their team was inside collecting valuable equipment and data, and the farmhouse remained dark and quiet. This illusion of normalcy was shattered when their radio earpieces suddenly crackled with panicked communications from inside. The disorienting effects of Mason's initial countermeasure were fading, allowing the trapped thieves to realize their predicament. "We're hit! Some kind of trap!" The transmission cut off abruptly as the speaker apparently recognized the need for communication discipline even in crisis. The lookouts immediately shifted to high alert, weapons appearing from concealed positions as they moved toward the storehouse. Their training was evident in their response, rapid but controlled, maintaining awareness of their surroundings while advancing to support their team. This reaction had also been anticipated. As they approached the loading bay doors, they triggered perimeter sensors that Mason had positioned specifically to detect responsive movement toward the primary entrance. The system interpreted this pattern correctly as additional hostiles responding to the initial defense activation. Mason watched from his concealed position as the lookouts reached the loading bay entrance and peered inside, tactical flashlights illuminating their immobilized companions. From their perspective, the situation must have appeared bizarre, two men struggling ineffectively against some invisible force holding them in place, two others hopelessly entangled in a mesh net that tightened with each movement. The lookouts hesitated, processing this unexpected scenario. In that moment of hesitation, Mason activated the next phase of his defensive system via the tablet control interface. The loading bay doors, which had remained open since the thieves' entry, suddenly began to close, driven by the building's hydraulic system now under Mason's remote control. The lookouts, startled by the unexpected movement, jumped back instinctively, avoiding being struck by the heavy doors. As they retreated from the closing doors, they triggered another set of pressure plates Mason had installed in the gravel just outside the loading bay. This activation set off the final external defensive measure, a specialized foam deployment system concealed in ordinary-looking irrigation pipes mounted on the storehouse exterior. The system released a rapidly expanding foam formulation developed for riot control situations. The compound was non-toxic and eventually biodegradable, but immediately effective. Upon contact with air, it expanded to 50 times its liquid volume, creating a disorienting visual barrier and physically impeding movement through its rapidly increasing density. Both lookouts were caught in the expanding foam cloud. Their training prompted them to retreat immediately, but the foam's rapid expansion rate made this difficult. Within seconds, they were struggling through chest-high foam that continued to solidify around them, restricting movement without causing injury. By 1:42 a.m., just 10 minutes after the thieves had first breached the storehouse, all 6 intruders had been effectively neutralized by Mason's defensive systems. None were injured, but none were capable of continuing their operation or escaping the scene. Mason moved from his observation position to a new vantage point that offered a clear view of the immobilized lookouts. They were still struggling against the hardening foam, their frustration evident in their increasingly desperate movements. Their weapons, what appeared to be semi-automatic pistols, had been dropped or holstered in their efforts to free themselves from the foam's grip. Inside the storehouse, the situation was similarly controlled. The tablet display showed all 4 intruders effectively immobilized, 2 by the adhesive system near the loading bay entrance, 2 by the mesh net deployment near the side door. Their equipment lay scattered where they had dropped it during the initial disorientation phase. Mason allowed himself a moment of professional satisfaction. The defensive system had performed exactly as designed, incapacitating the intruders without causing lasting harm, preserving evidence of their criminal intent, and protecting both the valuable equipment and proprietary agricultural data they had targeted. Now came the final phase of his plan, the involvement of legitimate authorities. Mason retrieved his cell phone and dialed Sheriff Dawson's direct number. The phone rang 3 times before a sleep-roughened voice answered. "Dawson here. This better be important at this hour." "Sheriff, it's Mason Everett out at Oak Ridge Farm. Those equipment thieves you've been looking for? I've got 6 of them caught in my storehouse. They're not going anywhere, but you might want to bring extra deputies for transport." A moment of stunned silence followed before the sheriff responded, suddenly sounding much more awake. "Caught them? What do you mean, catch them?" "Let's just say they encountered some unexpected security measures. They're contained and unharmed, but they'll need specialized removal from their current situation." "Damn Everett," the sheriff said, and Mason could hear him already moving, the sounds of rustling clothing coming through the line. "What kind of security system does that?" "Never mind. Tell me when I get there. I'm calling in my deputies now. Don't approach these men. They're potentially dangerous." "They're not going anywhere, Sheriff," Mason assured him, watching as one of the lookouts finally gave up struggling against the hardened foam and slumped in defeat. "Take your time. They'll be right here waiting for you." As Mason ended the call, he surveyed the results of his defensive planning. 6 professional thieves, likely with military or law enforcement backgrounds, had been completely neutralized by systems designed to incapacitate without injuring. The evidence of their attempted theft was preserved intact, ensuring successful prosecution. More importantly, a message had been sent. After tonight, word would spread through whatever network connected these professional thieves. Oak Ridge Farm was not an easy target. Some farmers were not defenseless. Some rural properties concealed unexpected capabilities. Some quiet men, living peaceful lives, were better left undisturbed. The flashing red and blue lights of Sheriff's Department vehicles cast eerie patterns across the farm as law enforcement responded to Mason's call. It had taken Sheriff Dawson 23 minutes to arrive with his 2 on-duty deputies, and another 17 minutes for the off-duty officers he'd summoned to join them. Mason stood on his porch, watching the methodical law enforcement response with a professional's appreciation. Despite the department's small size, Dawson ran a tight operation. The officers secured the perimeter first, established a command position, and only then approached the incapacitated intruders. Sheriff Hank Dawson, a barrel-chested man with gray streaks, dark hair and 27 years in law enforcement, approached Mason with a mixture of confusion and grudging admiration. "Mind telling me exactly what happened here?" he asked, removing his department-issue hat to run a hand through his hair. "And how 6 men, who've been hitting farms across 3 counties without leaving so much as a fingerprint, ended up, He gestured toward the storehouse, where deputies were photographing the thieves in their various states of immobilization. "Like that?" "Security measures," Mason replied. "Simply. After our conversation yesterday, I made some upgrades." Dawson's expression made it clear he recognized the understatement. "Upgrades," he repeated flatly. "Foam deployment systems and industrial adhesives aren't what most folks would call standard farm security, Everett." Mason shrugged. "I take protection of my property seriously." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing what he knew about Mason's background against what he was witnessing. Finally, he sighed. "Going to need a statement, and you're going to have to explain to me how exactly you manage this without violating about a dozen regulations. All measures are non-lethal, temporary, and deployed on private property in response to criminal trespass," Mason replied evenly. "I've reviewed the relevant statutes." Dawson's raised eyebrow suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, but had more pressing matters to address. "We'll come back to that. Right now, I need to figure out how to safely extract these men for transport. That adhesive has 2 of them stuck like flies on paper." "There's a solvent," Mason said, reaching into his pocket to produce a small spray bottle. Non-toxic, breaks down the polymer bonds. Takes about 90 seconds to work. The sheriff accepted. The bottle, with a look that suggested his questions about Mason's background, were multiplying by the minute. And the foam. It's biodegradable, breaks down on its own in about 6 hours, but water accelerates the process. Garden hose should do it. Dawson nodded slowly. Wait here. I'll need that statement after we get these men processed. As the sheriff returned to coordinate the extraction, Mason remained on the porch, observing the scene with clinical detachment. The operation had gone as planned, with all defensive measures performing to specifications. The thieves had been incapacitated without permanent injury, their criminal intent had been documented, and legitimate authorities were now taking control of the situation. Mission accomplished. Deputy Merrill, a young officer Mason recognized from town, approached the 2 foam-encased lookouts with the garden hose Mason had provided. As the water began dissolving the hardened material, features of the men became more visible. Both appeared to be in their 30s, with the lean, muscular builds of men who maintained military-level physical conditioning. Their clothing was nondescript, dark pants and jackets that would blend in almost anywhere. But the quality suggested professional tactical gear modified to appear civilian. One of the men, his face now visible as the foam dissolved around his head and shoulders, glared at Mason with cold recognition. Something in that gaze suggested this wasn't a random target selection. The man knew who Mason was, or at least thought he did. Inside the storehouse, deputies were applying the solvent to free the thieves trapped by the adhesive system. The process was methodical, freeing one limb at a time, securing it with handcuffs or zip ties before moving to the next. The thieves, caught in the mesh net, were being similarly processed, the specialized webbing cut away in sections to allow controlled extraction. Sheriff Dawson supervised the operation with professional efficiency, ensuring evidence was properly documented before any changes were made to the scene. Officers photographed the thieves' equipment, the targeted farm machinery, and the portable drives they had been using to steal agricultural data. As the deputies worked, Mason noticed something unusual about one of the thieves. A man in his mid-40s with a military-style crew cut who appeared to be the team leader. Unlike his companions, who maintained sullen silence during processing, this man seemed almost amused. His posture, despite being handcuffed and under guard, conveyed confidence rather than defeat. When the last thief had been extracted, photographed, and secured in a patrol car, Sheriff Dawson returned to where Mason waited. "None of them are talking yet," he said, tucking his notebook into his shirt pocket. "But based on IDs, those that are probably real, we've got 4 ex-military and 2 former law enforcement. Professional outfit," Mason nodded, unsurprised by the confirmation of his assessment. "Thing is," Dawson continued, lowering his voice, "they were carrying some sophisticated equipment, electronic countermeasures, tactical communications, specialized entry tools. This isn't standard equipment for farm thieves, even organized ones." "They weren't just after equipment," Mason replied. "They targeted my agricultural data, proprietary information about soil amendments, specialized grain varieties, yield optimization. That's valuable intellectual property." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "Industrial espionage, agricultural espionage. The equipment is just a bonus, high resale value on the black market. But the real target is farming innovations that took years to develop." Dawson processed this information, his expression darkening. "That matches what the Peterson boys reported. Said their developmental data was worth more than all their equipment combined." He glanced toward the patrol cars, where the thieves waited. "Still doesn't explain the military-grade gear or why their leader looks like this is all going according to plan." Mason had noticed the same thing, the team leader's inappropriate confidence despite being caught red-handed. Something wasn't adding up. "I'd like to speak with him," Mason said. The sheriff hesitated. "That's not standard procedure, Everett." "Neither," is catching professional thieves in foam and adhesive traps. Dawson conceded the point with a reluctant nod. 5 minutes, in my presence, and nothing that will compromise prosecution. The team leader was being held in Dawson's own vehicle, separated from his colleagues for tactical reasons. As Mason approached with the sheriff, he studied the man more carefully. Late 40s, fit, but showing signs of age, with the hardened features of someone who had seen significant combat. There was something vaguely familiar about him, though Mason couldn't immediately place why. Sheriff Dawson opened the rear door but kept the security partition closed, allowing conversation, while maintaining physical separation. "Mr. Everett has some questions," the sheriff said formally. "I suggest you cooperate. Might help your situation." The man smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Mason Everett," he said, emphasizing the name slightly. "Former Staff Sergeant, Army Special Forces, combat engineer with specialized training in defensive architecture and containment systems. Served in Afghanistan, Iraq, and," he paused deliberately, "other locations not listed in public records." Mason kept his expression neutral despite his surprise. This man hadn't just selected his farm randomly. He knew exactly who owned Oak Ridge. "You have me at a disadvantage," Mason replied evenly. "Ryan Delaney," the man offered without hesitation. "Former Marine Force Recon. We never met personally, but I know your work." He leaned forward slightly. "Particularly your innovations in non-lethal containment systems for high-value targets. Tonight was quite the demonstration." Dawson looked between the two men, clearly sensing the undercurrents but not fully understanding them. "You knew who I was before you targeted my farm," Mason stated rather than asked. Delaney's smile widened fractionally. "Let's just say your property was of particular interest for multiple reasons." "The agricultural data was just a cover," Mason realized aloud. "You wanted to assess my security capabilities, among other things." Delaney settled back against the seat, seemingly unconcerned by his handcuffs or situation. "You've been living quietly these past 7 years, Everett. Some people were curious if your skills had deteriorated." Sheriff Dawson cleared his throat. "You're admitting this was a targeted operation against Mr. Everett specifically?" Delaney shrugged. "I'm having a hypothetical conversation about agricultural security. Anything else would require my lawyer present." Mason studied the man with new understanding. This hadn't been a simple theft operation. It had been reconnaissance, assessment and provocation combined. The question was, who had authorized it and why? "Who's the client?" Mason asked directly. "You know how this works, Everett," Delaney replied smoothly. "Operational security, compartmentalized information." His expression became more serious. "But I will say this. Your name still carries weight in certain circles. Tonight's demonstration will generate significant interest." Sheriff Dawson had heard enough. "That's all for now," he said firmly, closing the vehicle door. Once they were out of earshot, he turned to Mason with narrowed eyes. "Want to tell me what that was about? Because that didn't sound like a conversation." "About farm equipment theft." Mason chose his words carefully. "My military background was in specialized defensive systems. It appears Mr. Delaney and whoever he's working for wanted to see if those skills were still intact." "Why?" Dawson pressed. "What's the point of targeting you specifically?" "I'm not sure," Mason admitted, though several possibilities were already forming in his mind. "But I intend to find out." The sheriff studied him for a long moment. "There's more to you than a retired soldier-turned-farmer, isn't there, Everett?" "Isn't there more to everyone than their current occupation, Sheriff?" Dawson didn't look satisfied with that philosophical deflection, but recognized he wouldn't get more at the moment. "I'll need a formal statement from you tomorrow. For now, we'll handle processing these men. I've called the FBI field office in Wichita. They're sending agents to interview the suspects, given the cross-county nature of these thefts and the potential corporate espionage angle." Mason nodded. "I'll be available tomorrow morning." As the sheriff rejoined his deputies, Mason returned to his porch to observe the final stages of the law enforcement response. The encounter with Delaney had changed his understanding of the night's events. What he had assumed was opportunistic theft targeting valuable equipment and proprietary agricultural data was actually a carefully orchestrated assessment of his capabilities. The question was, why now, after 7 years of quiet farming? His satellite phone vibrated in his pocket. The display showed an unlisted number, but the alphanumeric code at the beginning of the message identified it as coming from Colonel Harrington. Security breach at DARPA. Files on Project Perimeter. Accessed. Your name is on target list. Delaney initial probe. Others will follow. Call the secure line. Mason felt a cold certainty settle in his chest. Project Perimeter had been his final development work before leaving the military, a comprehensive system of non-lethal defensive measures designed for sensitive installation protection. The project had been classified at the highest levels, its innovations applicable to embassy security, nuclear facility protection, and other high-value government installations. If those files had been compromised and his name was on a target list, tonight's incident wasn't an isolated event. It was the opening move in a much larger operation. As the sheriff's vehicles pulled away with their prisoners, Mason entered his farmhouse and secured the door. The night's events had confirmed his defensive capabilities remained effective, but Delaney's team had been a probe, testing his readiness and response patterns. The next incursion would be better informed and more dangerous. He dialed the secure number from memory, encrypted protocols automatically engaging as the connection was established. "Harrington," came the clipped response. "It's Everett. I just had a visit from Ryan Delaney and 5 associates. They're in custody with the county sheriff, but Delaney made it clear this was an assessment operation, not a simple theft." "He's the first," Harrington confirmed. "DARPA breach included complete perimeter files and your personnel records. Someone is targeting the system architects. Dr. Chen was hit 3 days ago in Seattle. Dr. Abrams yesterday in Phoenix. Both survived, but the attackers escaped with technical data." Mason processed this information with growing concern. Chen had been the materials science specialist on Project Perimeter, developing the non-lethal adhesives and containment foams. Abrams had designed the sensory disorientation systems. Together, with Mason's defensive architecture expertise, they had created the most advanced, non-lethal security system ever developed for government use. "Who's behind it?" Mason asked. "Unknown," Harrington admitted, "but the operational patterns suggest state-sponsored, specifically Russians or possibly Chinese. They're after the complete perimeter system, technical specifications, deployment methodologies, countermeasure vulnerabilities, and they think the designers would have information not in the files," Mason concluded. It made tactical sense. Technical specifications were valuable, but the insights of the system's creators, including unpublished limitations, experimental features, and potential developments, would be priceless to any entity wanting to either replicate or defeat the technology. "Exactly," Harrington confirmed. "Delaney was likely contracted to assess your current capabilities before the primary team moves in. His capture may accelerate their timeline. Recommendations? Secure location transfer. I can have a team at your position in 4 hours." Mason considered the offer. Relocation to a military facility would provide immediate security, but would also remove him from terrain he had personally prepared. At Oakridge, he controlled the environment. Anywhere else, he would be surrendering that advantage. Negative, he decided. Better to maintain position on prepared ground, forward additional intelligence as available. "Your call, Harrington." "Acknowledged. But satellite surveillance shows increased activity near your location. Multiple vehicles on county roads performing what appears to be reconnaissance patterns. I estimate you have less than 24 hours before the primary team makes contact." "Understood. I'll prepare accordingly." After ending the call, Mason moved to his command position in the modified storage room at the rear of his farmhouse. The monitoring systems showed normal conditions across his property, but with new context from Harrington, he recognized subtle signs he had initially dismissed. Slight increases in night traffic on normally deserted county roads, signal anomalies, suggesting electronic surveillance, a commercial drone that had briefly overflown his property shortly after sunset. Reconnaissance indicators. The next team was already gathering information, likely accelerating their timeline given Delaney's capture. Mason activated the satellite uplink on his secure system, accessing encrypted databases that weren't available to the public. If state-sponsored, operators were targeting Project Perimeter designers. He needed to know exactly what they already had and what they might still be seeking. The files confirmed Harrington's assessment. Dr. Chen and Dr. Abrams had both been approached under false pretenses by individuals who later attempted to extract information through coercive means. Both had survived, but reported their assailants had specifically questioned them about aspects of the perimeter system not documented in official files, theoretical extensions, undocumented limitations, potential countermeasures. Mason was the final primary architect of the system. His expertise in defensive deployment represented the last piece needed to fully understand and potentially compromise a security system protecting some of America's most sensitive installations. The satellite imagery Harrington had referenced showed 4 vehicles moving in what appeared to be random patterns through Clagston County. To an untrained observer, they might seem like ordinary traffic, but Mason recognized the deliberate nature of their movements, establishing dominant terrain awareness, identifying potential approach and extraction routes, mapping law enforcement response patterns. Based on this information, he estimated the primary team would consist of 8 to 12 operators, with specialized training and equipment. Unlike Delaney's group, they wouldn't be testing his capabilities. They would be applying lessons learned from that initial probe, coming prepared to defeat the defensive measures they now knew existed. Mason began methodically planning his response. The defensive systems that had captured Delaney's team would need to be reconfigured. Their positions shifted, trigger mechanisms altered, deployment patterns modified. Predictability was the enemy of effective defense, and the next team would be expecting exactly what had worked against their predecessors. As he worked through the modifications, Mason considered the broader implications. After 7 years of peaceful farming, his past had found him again. The specialized knowledge he carried, knowledge that had once helped protect American interests around the world, now made him a target for forces seeking to compromise that same security. The irony wasn't lost on him. The defensive systems he had designed to protect others were now his own best hope for personal survival. By 4:30 a.m., Mason had completed the initial reconfiguration of his defensive systems. The storehouse, now processed as a crime scene and released back to his control, had been reset with modified countermeasures. Additional defensive positions had been established around the farmhouse and primary outbuildings. The property was as ready as it could be on short notice. But Mason harbored no illusions about the challenge ahead. State-sponsored operators with specific knowledge of his capabilities would be formidable opponents. The next encounter wouldn't be a simple matter of capturing intruders. It would be a direct confrontation with adversaries specifically prepared to defeat his systems. As dawn approached, casting long shadows across Oak Ridge Farm, Mason Everett prepared for what might be the most challenging defensive operation of his career. The peaceful farmer was fully awake now, replaced by the combat engineer who had once been among the military's most innovative defensive specialists. Someone wanted the secrets he carried. They were about to discover why some knowledge came with its own built-in protection, the expertise of the man who held it. The sunrise painted Kansas wheat fields gold as Mason completed his third perimeter check since dawn. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford with a professional strike team likely inbound. Instead, he'd used the early morning hours to implement critical modifications to his defensive strategy. With Delaney's team captured, Mason now faced adversaries who would arrive with specific intelligence about his initial countermeasures. Tactical adaptation was essential. He'd spent the pre-dawn hours reconfiguring trigger points, repositioning sensors, and altering response patterns throughout his property. At 7:15 a.m., Mason returned to the farmhouse and reviewed satellite imagery Harrington had forwarded. The 4 vehicles previously identified conducting reconnaissance had disappeared from county roads, but thermal imaging had detected what appeared to be a temporary staging area in an abandoned barn approximately 12 miles northeast of Oak Ridge Farm. The location made tactical sense, close enough for rapid deployment, but sufficiently distant to avoid casual discovery. Mason estimated a team of this sophistication would establish forward observation posts before any direct approach. They would be watching, learning his patterns, identifying potential vulnerabilities. Mason's satellite phone vibrated with an incoming message from Harrington. FBI debriefing Delaney confirms Russian SVR involvement. Primary team led by Viktor Kozlov, former Spetsnaz commander. Expertise in extraction operations. Estimated 10-12 operators with advanced equipment. Timeline accelerated. Expect contact within 12 hours. Evac teams standing by at your request. Mason considered the new information carefully. Kozlov was a known quantity in intelligence circles, a decorated special operations commander who had transitioned to intelligence work after distinguished military service. His involvement confirmed the seriousness of the operation and the value placed on Project Perimeter's secrets. The mention of extraction operations was particularly concerning. Kozlov specialized in recovering high-value targets, people with specialized knowledge worth extracting rather than simply eliminating. Mason wasn't facing assassins. He was facing a highly trained team intent on capturing him alive for interrogation. That created both advantages and challenges. Extraction teams typically employed non-lethal tactics to preserve their targets, which aligned with Mason's own preference for avoiding lethal force. However, it also meant they would be specifically equipped to counter the very types of non-lethal defensive measures he specialized in designing. Mason replied to Harrington with a brief status update, declining evacuation, but requesting specific intelligence on Kozlov's known tactical patterns and equipment preferences. Then he moved to the kitchen to prepare a substantial breakfast. Protein and complex carbohydrates to fuel what promised to be a physically demanding day. As he ate, Mason methodically assessed his position from the perspective of a professional adversary. Oak Ridge Farm presented both tactical challenges and opportunities. For an extraction team, the isolated location limited potential civilian interference or witnesses, but the open terrain surrounding the main structures offered minimal concealment for approach. The buildings themselves, farmhouse, barn, storehouse, and various outbuildings, created a complex tactical environment with multiple points of entry and numerous potential defensive positions. Kozlov would recognize these characteristics and plan accordingly. Based on standard SVR extraction protocols, Mason anticipated a multi-phase operation. Initial infiltration by a small reconnaissance element, followed by a coordinated approach under cover of darkness, culminating in a swift breach and capture. Operation. The question was timing. With Delaney's team in custody, Kozlov faced a difficult decision: accelerate the timeline before local authorities or federal agencies could establish protective measures around Mason, or delay to gather more intelligence and prepare more thoroughly. The message from Harrington suggested the former, which meant Mason needed to be ready for contact by nightfall. He spent the next hour conducting a methodical inventory of available resources. The specialized equipment Jackson had provided had been partially depleted during the encounter with Delaney's team, but Mason had preserved key components and maintained reserves of the most critical elements. Additional materials could be improvised from farm supplies, agricultural chemicals, irrigation components, and mechanical parts could be repurposed for defensive applications if necessary. At 9:00 a.m., Mason's security system alerted him to an approaching vehicle. The camera feed showed Sheriff Dawson's department SUV coming up the long drive alone. Mason verified there were no other vehicles in the vicinity before meeting the sheriff on the porch. Dawson looked like he hadn't slept, his uniform showing signs of a long night processing 6 prisoners and coordinating with federal authorities. "Those men you caught last night," he said without preamble, "they're being transferred to federal custody. FBI has classified the case as a matter of national security." Mason nodded, unsurprised. "Did they tell you why?" "Not specifically. Agent in charge mentioned potential ties to foreign intelligence activities." Dawson studied Mason with new intensity. "Said I should advise you to accept protective custody until the situation is resolved." "I appreciate the concern. That's not an acceptance, Everett." Mason offered a grim smile. "I'm more effective on ground, I've prepared, Sheriff." Dawson sighed, removing his hat to run a hand through his thinning hair. "Figured you'd say something like that, which is why I've authorized increased patrols on the county roads surrounding your property." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I've also spoken with state police about establishing a perimeter if needed." "That would put your officers at risk," Mason said. "These aren't ordinary criminals, Hank." The use of the sheriff's first name, something Mason rarely did, underscored the seriousness of his warning. "Then tell me what we're dealing with," Dawson pressed. "FBI's being typically tight-lipped, but I've got jurisdiction here, and I need to know what might be coming to my county." Mason considered how much to reveal. Dawson was a good law enforcement officer with a right to know about threats in his jurisdiction, but detailed information about Russian intelligence operations might exceed appropriate civilian disclosure. "The men last night were contractors, former military assessing farm security systems for potential vulnerabilities," Mason explained, offering a partial truth. "Their employer has ties to foreign interests concerned with agricultural technology. Theft. There's reason to believe a more professional team may attempt to continue their work." It wasn't the complete picture, but it provided Dawson with operational context without compromising classified details. "And your involvement goes beyond being a simple farmer with extraordinarily effective security measures," Dawson stated rather than asked. "My background in military engineering made me a resource for developing certain protective systems," Mason acknowledged. "That expertise may be what they're targeting." The sheriff absorbed this information with a thoughtful nod. "I can have deputies stationed on your property within the hour." "Better to maintain distance," Mason advised. "These people are professionals. Law enforcement presence would just create additional targets and complications." "So what am I supposed to do? Just wait until something happens? Maintain your increased patrols, but keep a half-mile perimeter from my property. Monitor for unusual vehicles or personnel in the surrounding area, and have medical response units on standby." Seeing the sheriff's expression, Mason added, "Precautionary only. I don't anticipate casualties, but preparation is prudent." Dawson clearly wasn't satisfied, but recognized the practicality of Mason's recommendations. "I'll need hourly radio checks, Miss One, and I'm coming in with everything I've got." "Fair enough." After the sheriff departed, Mason returned to his security center and reviewed the latest satellite data. The thermal signatures at the suspected staging area had dispersed, suggesting the team was now mobile. They were likely establishing observation positions around his property, preparing for tonight's operation. Mason activated a specialized application on his secure system, one not available to civilian users. The program interfaced with military-grade satellite systems to scan for electronic emissions within a specified radius. Almost immediately, it identified 4 distinct signals consistent with tactical communications equipment, all positioned around his property at distances between 800 and 200 yards, forward observers, just as he'd anticipated. Their positioning created overlapping fields of observation, covering all approaches to the main structures. They were being careful to maintain distances that would typically be beyond the range of standard security systems. Unfortunately for them, Mason's capabilities weren't standard. He noted each observer's position on his tactical map. Their distribution followed predictable patterns for an operation of this type. Primary focus on the farmhouse, with secondary coverage of outbuildings and potential escape routes. The positioning revealed something about Kozlov's thinking. The Russian commander was establishing comprehensive surveillance before committing his main force. That bought Mason time, but also meant the coming operation would be meticulously planned based on observed patterns and vulnerabilities. He needed to feed them information that would shape their approach in ways advantageous to his defensive strategy. For the next several hours, Mason engaged in a subtle form of counterintelligence. He moved around the property in patterns designed to suggest specific security procedures and vulnerabilities. He visibly reinforced certain entries while seemingly neglecting others. He arranged equipment and materials to indicate defensive. Preparations focused on the farmhouse rather than outbuildings. All of it was misdirection. The actual defensive measures were being implemented in ways invisible to even sophisticated observation. Mason was creating a tactical narrative for Kozlov's team to interpret, one that would lead them precisely where he wanted them to go. At noon, Mason made a show of driving into town, ostensibly for supplies, but actually to verify he wasn't under direct physical surveillance and to implement the next phase of his strategy. At Millie's diner, he had lunch at his usual table while conducting a careful study of other patrons. None showed the subtle indicators of professional surveillance operators, but Mason noticed 2 unfamiliar men in a black SUV parked across the street. Maintaining line of sight to the diner entrance, Millie approached his table with a coffee pot and her characteristic directness. "Town's buzzing about what happened at your place last night," she said, refilling his cup. "Sheriff's not saying much officially, but deputies talk." "Not much to tell," Mason replied with careful casualness. "Some thieves tried to steal equipment. Security system caught them." Millie's expression made it clear she knew there was more to the story. "Security system, huh? Must be quite something to catch 6 men who've been hitting farms across 3 counties without leaving a trace." Mason shrugged. "Just good preparation." She glanced toward the window, her experienced eyes noting the unfamiliar vehicle. "Those men have been there since you arrived. Friends of yours?" "Not exactly." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Trouble." "Potentially." Millie nodded once, decisively. "Caroline and Tommy are visiting her sister in Wichita today. Should I call and suggest they extend their stay?" Mason appreciated her perceptiveness. "Might be prudent." "What about you?" "Sheriff mentioned something about protective custody." "I'll be fine," Mason assured her. "Just a security issue that needs resolving." Millie studied him for a moment before nodding again. "You need anything, you call. Frank at the hardware store, Jim at the feedlot, half the farmers in the county. They all remember how you helped when that tornado hit last spring. Community takes care of its own. The simple offer of assistance from ordinary townspeople against professional intelligence operators might have seemed naive, but Mason understood the sentiment behind it. In his years at Oak Ridge, he'd become part of this community in ways he hadn't anticipated when seeking isolation after military service. "I appreciate that, Millie. Best thing everyone can do is stay clear of my property for the next day or two, just a precaution." After finishing lunch, Mason made several additional stops around town. The hardware store for miscellaneous supplies, the farm equipment dealer for a specialized irrigation component, and finally, the bank, where he accessed his safe deposit box to retrieve an item he'd hoped never to need again. The small key fob looked innocuous, just another electronic car key, but contained sophisticated encryption technology that provided emergency access to classified military resources. Mason had been authorized to retain it upon leaving service, one of the few acknowledgments of his particular value to national security. Throughout his circuit of Clagston, the black SUV maintained discreet distance. The surveillance was professional but intentionally visible, a message that he was being watched. Kozlov was establishing psychological pressure while gathering final intelligence before tonight's operation. Mason returned to Oak Ridge in the early afternoon, noting that the electronic signatures of the observation teams had shifted slightly to maintain optimal positions. They were adapting to his movements, which confirmed their professionalism and purpose. Back at the farmhouse, Mason began final preparations. The defensive systems were reconfigured, trigger mechanisms adjusted, and response patterns modified to account for the anticipated approach vectors of Kozlov's team. Additional countermeasures were implemented specifically designed to defeat the specialized equipment SVR extraction teams typically employed. By 4 p.m., Mason had completed essential defensive preparations and moved to contingency planning. If his primary defenses failed, he needed fallback positions and extraction routes of his own. He established 3 emergency evacuation paths from the property, each equipped with distinctive countermeasures to delay pursuers. A call to Harrington provided updated intelligence. Kozlov's operational history shows consistent patterns, the colonel explained. Initial approach under cover of darkness, typically between 0100 and 0300 hours, when human alertness is at its lowest. Multiple simultaneous entry points to overwhelm defensive responses. Non-lethal but incapacitating tactics. Flashbangs, disorientation devices, targeted electronic warfare to disable security systems. Equipment profile, Mason asked. Latest generation tactical gear, body armor rated for high-velocity impact, advanced night vision with thermal overlay capabilities, communication systems with frequency-hopping encryption to prevent interception. And based on recent operations, they've likely acquired countermeasures specifically designed to defeat adhesive and foam-based defensive systems like those you deployed against Delaney's team. The information confirmed Mason's assumptions. Kozlov would come prepared for the defenses that had captured Delaney's group. That necessitated a completely different approach, one the Russian commander wouldn't anticipate. Timeline, Mason asked. Satellite tracking shows increased activity at the staging area. They're preparing for deployment. I'd estimate the execution phase begins around midnight, with the approach to your position completed by 0200 hours. Any change to team composition? Intelligence suggests 10 operators plus Kozlov himself. 4-man observation team already. In position, with 6-man assault element preparing at the staging area, multiple vehicles for approach and extraction, comprehensive tactical package. Mason absorbed this information, mentally adjusting his defensive strategy to account for the specific threat profile. 11 professionals with advanced equipment presented a significant challenge, but their objective, capturing him alive for interrogation, created exploitable constraints on their operational parameters. Extraction teams still on standby? Mason asked. Affirmative. 30 minutes from your location on my order. Hold them in reserve unless specifically requested. Better to resolve this without escalation, if possible. After ending the call, Mason conducted one final inspection of his defensive preparations. Each system was functioning as designed, sensors calibrated, response mechanisms primed. The property was as ready as it could be, given the time constraints and available resources. As evening approached, Mason prepared himself mentally and physically for the coming confrontation. He consumed a light meal designed for sustained energy, checked his equipment, and reviewed his tactical map one final time. The observation posts remained in position, their electronic signatures steady, awaiting the arrival of the main assault team. From his command position in the farmhouse, Mason watched as darkness fell across Oak Ridge Farm. The wheat fields that had gleaned gold in the morning sun now lay in shadow, concealing potential approach routes for Kozlov's team. Security cameras with night vision capabilities monitored key areas, their feeds displaying on screens in Mason's command center, but he knew professional operators would identify and avoid obvious surveillance zones. The game would be played in the shadows between known observation points, in the subtle interaction of measure and countermeasure that defined high-level tactical operations. It would be chess, not checkers, a contest of anticipation and adaptation, rather than simple force application. As the first stars appeared in the Kansas sky, Mason Everett completed his preparations and settled in to wait. The peaceful farmer had fully receded now, replaced by the combat engineer who had once designed defensive systems for America's most sensitive installations. Tonight would determine whether those skills had been maintained through 7 years of agricultural focus. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, Viktor Kozlov and his team were preparing their approach. They were coming for the secrets in Mason's mind, the classified knowledge that could compromise national security if extracted. They had trained for this, equipped specifically for this target, and studied their objective methodically. But they couldn't know was that Mason Everett had spent a lifetime preparing for this exact scenario, creating systems specifically designed to defeat even the most sophisticated intrusion attempts. His entire career had been built around the principle that proper defensive preparation could counter any offensive capability. Tonight would put that principle to its ultimate test. The darkness deepened over Oak Ridge Farm as midnight approached. Mason sat motionless in his command center, monitoring feeds from thermal cameras strategically positioned around his property. The 4 observation posts remained in position, but satellite data from Harrington now showed vehicle movement approaching. From the northeast, the main strike team was en route. Mason's preparations were complete. The farmhouse, barn, and storehouse had been transformed into a sophisticated defensive network unlike anything Kozlov's team would have encountered before. Unlike the systems that captured Delaney's group, these countermeasures were designed specifically to counter the tactics and equipment of professional extraction teams. At 12:17 a.m., Mason's monitoring systems detected the first tactical incursion. 3 vehicles stopped on a county road approximately 1 mile from the farm, their engines and lights extinguished. Thermal imaging showed 10 heat signatures deploying in a precise pattern, 3 4-man elements, with what appeared to be Kozlov himself, directing operations from a command position. Their approach was methodical and professional. Rather than moving directly toward the main structures, they established a wider perimeter, likely placing additional sensors and countermeasures to detect or prevent escape attempts. The observation teams remained in position, maintaining surveillance. While the assault elements began their cautious advance, Mason watched, impressed despite himself. Their movement patterns showed excellent tactical discipline, utilizing available cover, maintaining appropriate intervals, advancing in coordinated phases with covering elements. Had he been employing standard security measures, their approach would have been nearly impossible to detect until they were already on the main property, but Mason's systems were far from standard. Specialized seismic sensors detected their movements through vibrations too subtle for conventional equipment. Thermal imaging systems distinguished between animal and human heat signatures. Directional microphones filtered environmental sounds to isolate the distinctive acoustic patterns of tactical movement. By 1:05 a.m., the assault team had reached the outer defensive perimeter, an invisible boundary 200 yards from the main structures. Here, Mason had implemented his first counter-surveillance measures, subtle electronic emissions designed to interfere with their communication systems began broadcasting at precisely calculated frequencies, not enough to alert them to detection, but sufficient to degrade coordination and introduce small uncertainties into their operation. Mason watched as their formation subtly adjusted in response to the communication issues. They were good, immediately, implementing alternate protocols without breaking movement rhythm. Kozlov would have trained them for communications disruption. The assault team split into 3 elements as expected. 4 operators approached the farmhouse from different angles. 4 more converged on the barn. 2, likely including Kozlov himself, maintained a command position with oversight of both structures. None approached the storehouse directly. They had studied the previous night's operation and recognized it as a potential trap. Instead, they focused on the farmhouse, where Mason would logically be at this hour. Their thermal imaging would detect a heat signature in the master bedroom consistent with a sleeping occupant. What they couldn't know was that the signature was generated by a specialized device designed to mimic human thermal output. Mason wasn't in the farmhouse at all. From his actual position in a concealed observation post between the barn and storehouse, Mason monitored their approach through his tablet. As they reached the final approach to the farmhouse, he activated the first active countermeasure. Buried directional speakers suddenly emitted infrasound at a frequency just below human auditory perception. The sound waves, though not consciously, heard created immediate physiological effects, subtle disorientation, slight nausea, and a psychological sensation of unease. The effects weren't debilitating, but would degrade operational efficiency and decision-making. The assault team hesitated, their disciplined movement momentarily disrupted as they processed the unfamiliar sensations. Mason watched as they conducted equipment checks, likely suspecting a technological malfunction rather than a deliberate countermeasure. After a brief pause, they resumed their approach, now moving with increased caution. The lead element reached the farmhouse porch at precisely 1:17 a.m. Their point man examined the door with specialized equipment, checking for obvious security measures or traps. Finding none, because Mason had deliberately left the door's security systems inactive, the team prepared to breach. Standard protocol for an extraction operation, simultaneous entry through multiple points, swift room clearance, target identification and capture before resistance could organize. Mason allowed them to initiate their breach. The door opened smoothly, presenting no resistance. The first 2 operators entered in perfect tactical form, night vision gear allowing them to navigate the darkened interior with confidence. They found nothing unusual in the entry hall. No traps, no obvious security measures, nothing to suggest preparation for their arrival. This increased their confidence, allowing them to advance further into the structure toward the heat signature in the master bedroom. As the second 2-man team entered through a side window, Mason activated the farmhouse interior defense system. The effect was immediate and comprehensive. Every reflective surface in the house, windows, mirrors, polished wood floors, stainless steel appliances, suddenly emitted a precisely calibrated light pattern designed to interfere with advanced night vision equipment. Not bright enough to be visible from outside, but devastating to operators dependent on light amplification technology. Simultaneously, ultrasonic emitters activated at frequencies calibrated to affect the inner ear, disrupting balance and spatial orientation without causing permanent damage. The combination, visual disruption and vestibular interference, created immediate tactical chaos. The operators in the farmhouse staggered, suddenly robbed of both vision and equilibrium. Their communications erupted with terse status reports as they struggled to adapt to the unexpected defensive measure. Outside, Kozlov would be receiving fragmented information indicating a serious disruption to the primary assault element. Mason shifted his attention to the second team approaching the barn. They had paused upon hearing the distress from their colleagues, exhibiting appropriate tactical caution. After a brief communication exchange, they resumed their approach, now moving with heightened alertness. This caution wouldn't save them from what awaited in the barn. As the first operator crossed the threshold, motion sensors activated a completely different defensive system. Compressed air deployed a specialized powder throughout the structure, a non-toxic compound that adhered to equipment, skin, and clothing. On contact, the powder itself was harmless but served a critical purpose. It contained metallic particles that interfered with electronics, disrupting communications and degrading equipment functionality. More importantly, it rendered the operators instantly identifiable through specialized imaging systems, eliminating any camouflage advantage and marking them for tracking if they retreated. Both assault elements were now compromised, not injured or immediately incapacitated, but significantly degraded in operational capability. Their advanced equipment, rather than providing tactical advantage, had become a vulnerability when confronted, with countermeasures specifically designed to exploit its limitations. From his command position, Kozlov would be assessing a rapidly deteriorating situation. Professional that he was, Mason anticipated an immediate tactical adjustment, likely a withdrawal and reassessment rather than commitment of additional resources to a compromised operation. Mason activated the directional microphone focused on Kozlov's position, catching fragments of rapid Russian as the commander ordered his teams to extract and regroup. The order confirmed Mason's assessment of the Russians' professionalism. Kozlov recognized when tactical advantage had been lost and wasn't willing to sacrifice his operators in a compromised approach. The teams began executing a disciplined withdrawal, maintaining security despite their degraded capabilities. Mason allowed them to retreat approximately 50 yards from the structures before implementing the final phase of his defensive plan. With precise timing, Mason triggered a comprehensive perimeter activation. Every access route from the property suddenly illuminated with high-intensity lighting, eliminating darkness as concealment. Simultaneously, the Sheriff's Department frequency broadcast an automated alert announcing law enforcement response to Oak Ridge Farm. The message was a bluff. Mason hadn't actually contacted Dawson, but Kozlov wouldn't know that. From the Russians' perspective, the operation had not only encountered sophisticated countermeasures, but was now facing imminent law enforcement intervention. Mason watched as Kozlov made the only reasonable decision available to a professional in his position. He ordered immediate full withdrawal to the vehicles. The assault teams moved with impressive discipline despite their compromised condition, maintaining tactical formation even in retreat. Rather than immediately pursuing or attempting capture, Mason allowed them to withdraw. His objective wasn't to engage in direct confrontation, but to deliver a message: extraction of Project Perimeter. Information from him would not be feasible through these means. As the Russian team reached their vehicles and began departure procedures, Mason activated his secure satellite communication system. The encrypted message went directly to Harrington. The Kozlov team neutralized and withdrew. No casualties, no direct engagement. Recommend immediate diplomatic action, citing attempted foreign intelligence operation on U.S. soil with supporting evidence. Harrington's response came within 30 seconds. Understood. Surveillance assets tracking withdrawal. State Department notified. Russian ambassador being called in for consultation. Extraction team still on standby for your location. Mason declined. The extraction offer again. The immediate threat was retreating, and diplomatic channels would now address the broader situation. Covert operations survived on deniability. Once formally acknowledged through diplomatic channels, the operation would lose critical protection, forcing the Russians to abandon this approach. By 2:15 a.m., satellite confirmation showed the Russian team had completely withdrawn from the area surrounding Oak Ridge Farm. Their vehicles were moving northeast at high speed, likely heading for pre-established exfiltration points where they could transition to less conspicuous transportation. Mason conducted a thorough sweep of his property to ensure no surveillance devices or personnel remained. Finding nothing, he returned to the farmhouse and began systematically deactivating the specialized defensive systems. Each countermeasure was carefully shut down, reset, and in some cases, concealed for potential future use. The immediate crisis had passed, but Mason harbored no illusions about its conclusion. State-sponsored intelligence operations rarely ended with a single failed attempt. The Russians might shift tactics or temporarily withdraw, but the value of Project Perimeter's secrets ensured ongoing interest. As dawn approached, casting long shadows across the farm, Mason placed another call to Harrington. "Status update?" he asked when the connection was secured. "The Russian team has disappeared from surveillance coverage," Harrington reported, "likely using prepared extraction routes with diplomatic cover. The State Department has formally presented evidence of unauthorized intelligence operations to the Russian ambassador. The usual denials, but they know we know. And the other perimeter designers? Dr. Chen and Dr. Abrams have accepted protective custody. You're the only one still exposed." Mason considered this information thoughtfully. His colleague's decision was logical given the circumstances. The protective custody Harrington offered would provide immediate security, but would also remove Mason from the life he'd built at Oak Ridge, the peace he'd sought after leaving military service. The diplomatic intervention changes their calculus, Mason noted. Direct extraction attempts become too costly politically. They'll shift to softer approaches: recruitment, bribery, long-term infiltration, all of which would be significantly more difficult to execute if you were in a secured facility, Harrington pointed out. Mason smiled slightly. "But significantly easier to detect in an environment I control." "Your call," Harrington conceded. "But I'm maintaining a response team on standby for the foreseeable future." After ending the call, Mason began the process of restoring Oak Ridge Farm to its normal appearance. The specialized equipment was carefully stored in concealed locations. Defensive systems returned to standby status, and obvious modifications removed or disguised. By the time Sheriff Dawson's patrol car appeared on the drive at 7:30 a.m., the farm showed no visible evidence of the night's events. Mason met the sheriff on the porch with a cup of coffee already prepared for the visibly tired law enforcement officer. "Missed your hourly check-in at 3 a.m., Dawson said, accepting the coffee with a nod of appreciation. "Was about to organize a response when your call came through. Had some visitors," Mason acknowledged. "They've moved on." Dawson studied the farm with professional attention, noting the absence of obvious disturbance. "Same group as before. Related interests. More professional, less successful." The sheriff's expression suggested he was filling in considerable blanks in Mason's sparse narrative. "FBI will want details. They'll get what's appropriate. Some aspects fall under national security restrictions." Dawson nodded slowly, understanding. "The limitations. These people likely to return." "Not in the same way," Mason assessed. "The approach has been compromised. They'll reassess and adapt." "And you'll be ready when they do," Dawson stated rather than asked. Mason allowed himself a small smile. "I generally am." After the sheriff departed, Mason completed his morning farm routine with methodical precision. The cattle needed attention. Regardless of international intelligence operations, the wheat fields required inspection despite the night's activities. The rhythms of agricultural life continued uninterrupted, providing a grounding normalcy that Mason had come to value during his years at Oak Ridge. By mid-morning, Mason drove into Clagston for his regular coffee at Millie's Diner. The routine was partly personal preference, but also strategic messaging, demonstrating normalcy and confidence after the night's events. Millie greeted him with her characteristic directness. "You look like you didn't sleep a wink." "Had some matters to attend to," Mason replied, accepting the coffee she poured without asking. Her shrewd eyes studied him carefully. "Those matters resolved, for now." Caroline approached with his usual breakfast order, her expression carrying concern that mirrored her mother's. "Tommy and I got back from Wichita this morning. Sheriff's deputy was waiting at our house. Said we should check with you before coming out to the farm for Tommy's combined lesson next week. Just a precaution," Mason assured her. "Everything's fine now. Tommy's welcome any time after harvest starts." She nodded, though her expression suggested she understood more than he'd explicitly stated. "Be careful, Mason. Community needs its quiet farmers." After breakfast, Mason visited the hardware store where Frank Wilson was already holding a box of supplies based on Mason's regular purchasing patterns. "Heard you had some excitement up at Oak Ridge," the older man said conversationally. "Second group of unwelcome visitors in 2 nights. Getting to be a pattern." News traveled fast in small communities. Mason accepted the box with a nod of appreciation. "Just some confusion about property boundaries. All sorted now," Frank chuckled. "That's what we're telling folks. But just so you know, 6 farmers from the county called this morning. Said to let you know they're available if you need any help sorting boundaries in the future." The simple offer of assistance, naive in the context of professional intelligence operations, nevertheless carried genuine meaning. In his years at Oak Ridge, Mason had become part of this community in ways he hadn't anticipated, forming connections that transcended his deliberate initial isolation. "Appreciate the thought," Mason replied, "but everything's under control." By afternoon, Mason had returned to Oak Ridge and completed essential farm work. Harvest preparations continued uninterrupted, the rhythms of agricultural life providing a stabilizing counterpoint to the night's clandestine activities. His satellite phone vibrated with a final update from Harrington. Russian team confirmed, exiting U.S. territory via diplomatic channels. Formal protests lodged through the State Department. Project Perimeter security protocols being strengthened at all installations. "Thank you for your continued service, Mason." The message carried formal language but also personal acknowledgement. Mason had protected not just himself, but national security assets that remained actively deployed around the world. The systems he had helped design would continue safeguarding American installations and personnel. As evening approached, Mason stood on his porch watching the sunset paint the wheat fields in shades of gold and amber. The farm stood peaceful in the waning light, showing no signs of the sophisticated defensive systems concealed throughout the property or the night's confrontation with foreign intelligence operatives. He had come to Kansas seeking peace after years of classified operations and covert deployments. That peace had been temporarily disrupted, but not permanently broken. Oak Ridge Farm remained his home, his private kingdom carved from the heartland's rich soil. The knowledge he carried, the secrets that made him a target, remained secure. The quiet farmer had reminded certain foreign interests why some targets weren't worth pursuing, why some operations carried costs too high to justify, and why some knowledge was best left undisturbed in the minds of those who created it. Mason Everett turned toward his farmhouse as darkness began to fall. Tomorrow would bring harvest preparations, equipment maintenance, and the mundane tasks of agricultural life. It would also bring continued vigilance, ongoing security precautions, and the readiness that had become second nature through decades of specialized service. The balance between farmer and protector, between civilian and operator, between peace and readiness, that was the life he had chosen. Not perfect, perhaps, but authentic and purposeful in its own way. As stars began appearing in the vast Kansas sky, Mason took one final look at his property before heading inside. Oak Ridge Farm stood secure in the gathering darkness, its defenses invisible but effective, its occupant both ordinary and exceptional. The storehouse that had been the focus of so much attention over the past 2 days was just another agricultural building to casual observation. But those who had attempted to breach it had learned a costly lesson about its owner. Some quiet farmers had skills beyond agriculture. Some rural properties concealed capabilities beyond farming. Some knowledge, once acquired through years of specialized service, never truly faded. And some men, seeking peace after lives of covert service, remained formidable when that peace was threatened. Mason Everett closed his farmhouse door on the Kansas night, secure in the knowledge that his defenses had proven effective, his secrets remained protected, and his chosen life could continue. The world beyond Oak Ridge Farm might still hold interests who valued what he knew, but they had received an unmistakable message about the costs of pursuing that knowledge. The quiet farmer would sleep well tonight, knowing that his storehouse and the more valuable contents of his mind remained secure behind defenses that had proven equal to the most sophisticated intrusion attempts. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for tonight, peace had been defended and preserved through the very skills that had once taken him far from this land. Sometimes the most effective security wasn't found in government installations or military compounds, but in the quiet vigilance of those who understood that peace often required readiness to defend it. Tonight, that understanding had protected not just a Kansas farm, but secrets vital to national security. Mason Everett, farmer and protector, had proven once again why some quiet men living peaceful lives were better left undisturbed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us